You're not stuck. You're just holding on to who you used to be. Here's how to let go. The grip you don't see. You are physically in this room, but your mind is replaying a conversation from 3 years ago. You're punishing yourself for a version of you that no longer exists, defending choices made by someone you've already grown past, and yet here you are, still carrying them. That's not reflection, that's the grip. Most people think being stuck means not moving, but you've moved. You left the job, ended the relationship, started over, maybe more than once. The external chapter closed, and still somehow the internal one didn't. You brought the same unease into the new situation, the same limits, the same version of yourself operating just below the surface of every fresh start, quietly shaping what feels possible before any decision is ever made. That specific feeling of doing everything right on the outside while something inside refuses to shift is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have. And almost nobody names it accurately. Here is what nobody tells you about that feeling. It is not a sign that you are broken or uncommitted or incapable of change. It is a sign that you changed the scenery, but brought the same self. Not the version of yourself you are now, the version you used to be. The one built for a chapter of life that has already ended. That is what being stuck actually is, not the absence of movement, the presence of a former self that was never given permission to leave. Most people spend years trying to solve that problem from the outside. Better plan, better habits, better environment. It doesn't work. Not because those things are useless, but because the obstruction was never external. It was always the grip of an older identity, operating below the level of conscious awareness, shaping what feels possible before any decision is ever made. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 9, paragraph 28, that loss is nothing more than change, and that change is the nature of all things. He was not being consoling. He was identifying a mechanism. The suffering is never in the change itself. It is in the refusal to move with it, in the loyalty to a version of the self that the actual life has already moved past. In this video, you will understand exactly how a former identity becomes an invisible barrier, not through weakness or failure, but through the ordinary operation of a mind doing precisely what it was built to do. You will see where the grip is, what it costs, and what the Stoics identified as the only genuine way to release it. Not a technique, not a reframe, a real understanding of what is actually happening and what finally letting go of it actually requires. How identity becomes a cage. The mind does not build identity carelessly. It builds it the way an architect builds a load-bearing wall, deliberately, incrementally, in response to real structural needs. Every self-concept, every role, every story a person tells about who they are, began as a response to something genuine, an environment that required adaptation, a relationship that demanded a particular shape, a set of experiences that produced, through repetition, a coherent sense of what kind of person this was and what kind of life they were living. That process is not a mistake. It is one of the most sophisticated things the human mind does, because identity isn't merely psychological decoration, it is infrastructure. It provides continuity across time, predictability in behavior, and the sense of coherent selfhood that makes sustained effort, meaningful relationship, and long-term planning possible. Without it, every morning would require starting from zero. The problem is not that the mind builds identity. The problem is that it builds it to last, and then defends what it built with a tenacity that doesn't distinguish between structures that still serve and structures that have outlived the conditions that made them necessary. William James, in the Principles of Psychology, observed that the sense of personal identity across time is one of the most powerful and least examined assumptions a person makes about themselves. The belief that the self of today is continuous with the self of 10 years ago, that there is a thread of sameness running through all the changes in circumstance, relationship, and belief, is not a discovery. It is a construction. one that the mind maintains actively and protects fiercely because the alternative, genuine discontinuity, the recognition that the self is not a fixed thing but a process, is experienced not as philosophical insight but as existential threat. This is the mechanism through which a former identity becomes a cage, not through any failure of intelligence or courage, but through the ordinary operation of a mind doing its job. The role that defined you for a decade, professional, relational, social, doesn't simply expire when the circumstances change. It continues to generate the same patterns, the same reflexes, the same interpretations of new situations through its own established lens. Epictetus addressed this in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 19, where he described the person who mistakes their role for their nature, who has worn a particular identity so long that they can no longer locate the difference between the costume and the self beneath it. That confusion is not vanity. It is the natural consequence of a construction so thorough and so long-standing that dismantling any part of it feels like dismantling something essential rather than something contingent. The cage doesn't have visible bars, it has familiar walls, and the familiarity is precisely what makes it so difficult to recognize as confinement and so costly to remain inside. The grief nobody names. Stop for a second. Think about the last chapter of your life that genuinely ended, the relationship, the career, the version of yourself that existed inside a particular place, a particular community, a particular way of understanding who you were. Did you ever actually mourn it? Not moved on from it, not replaced it, mourned it, sat with the reality of what ended, acknowledged what it cost to build and gave it a real goodbye before asking it to step aside. Most people haven't, and that unanswered grief is exactly what becomes the grip. There is a loss that most people never fully mourn, not because it wasn't real, but because the culture has no clear ritual for it, no recognized category into which it fits, no language adequate to describe what is actually being lost. It is not the loss of a person or a relationship or a concrete thing. It is the loss of a self, of a chapter, of a version of life that was genuine and mattered and is now irrevocably over. This loss happens to almost everyone who grows. It accompanies every significant transition, the end of a career identity, the dissolution of a long relationship, the departure from a community or a belief system or a way of understanding the world that organized life for years. And in almost every case it goes unnamed, because naming it would require acknowledging something that the culture of self-improvement actively discourages, that moving forward is not only gain, it is also always loss. Erik Erikson, in his work on identity and the life cycle, described the transitions between developmental stages not as clean progressions, but as genuine crises, moments of disorganization in which the old structure has become inadequate, but the new one has not yet formed. The tolerance of that discomfort, he argued, was not a sign of weakness. It was the specific psychological work of genuine development. What makes the grief of identity loss particularly difficult is that it has no socially legible object. When a person loses someone they love, the loss is visible. There are structures for it. But when a person loses a version of themselves, there is no funeral, no ritual, no permission structure. There is often only the expectation that they will move forward. The loss beneath the transition goes unwitnessed, and what goes unwitnessed cannot be fully processed. Seneca wrote in Letter 99 that the person who refuses to mourn what has genuinely ended is not strong. They are unfinished. The grief that is avoided doesn't disappear. It becomes the weight that makes every subsequent step heavier than it should be. What you carry deserves to be set down with care, not discarded, not denied. Set down, with the full recognition of what it was, what it cost to build, and what it meant while it lasted. Only then does the hands-free forward movement become genuinely possible. Why the mind fights change it actually wants. This is the paradox that most self-improvement frameworks never adequately explain, and that leaves the people inside it feeling, beneath the frustration, quietly ashamed. You want the change. You have wanted it consciously and sincerely for long enough that the wanting itself has become exhausting. You understand intellectually what needs to shift, and yet the pattern persists. The same reactions, the same limits, the same version of yourself showing up in new situations with old responses, as though the understanding never quite reached the place where behavior is actually made. The explanation is not a lack of willpower. It is something more fundamental and more forgivable than any of those things. It is the fact that the brain does not treat identity change as growth, it treats it as threat. The neuroscience here is unambiguous. The sense of a stable, continuous self is not a philosophical preference. It is a biological requirement. The brain's default mode network, which governs self-referential thought and the maintenance of autobiographical identity, responds to the dissolution of core self-concepts with the same alarm cascade it produces in response to physical danger. Not metaphorically, physiologically. The prospect of becoming genuinely different, not just behaving differently but being different at the level of the organizing self-concept, activates the threat detection system. And the threat detection system's primary function is not growth, it is preservation. You felt this. The moment a real change becomes possible, when you're finally on the edge of something different, and something pulls you back, not laziness, not fear exactly, something older, something that says this isn't safe, stay where you're known. This means that the resistance to identity change is not irrational. It is the mind operating exactly as designed, protecting the structural integrity of the self against what it registers correctly as a form of dissolution. The problem is not the mechanism. The problem is that the mechanism cannot distinguish between dissolution that threatens survival and dissolution that enables development. Marcus Aurelius was acutely aware of this pull toward the familiar, and equally aware of its cost. In the Meditations, Book 6, Paragraph 2, he wrote that the obstacle to action advances the action, that the very resistance encountered in the direction of genuine change is, when understood correctly, the signal that the direction is real. Epictetus made a complementary observation in the Enchiridion, Chapter 1, that people are disturbed not by things, but by their opinions about things, and that among the most disturbing opinions available is the one that says the self is fixed, that its current configuration is both accurate and final, and that any significant departure from it represents loss rather than liberation. The mind that fights the change it wants is not broken. It is doing its job with remarkable efficiency. What it needs is not to be overpowered. Willpower applied against the threat detection system is almost always a losing contest, but to be shown, through repeated and embodied experience, that the dissolution it fears is not the end of the self. It is the end of a version of the self, the Stoic view of impermanence. Here is a contradiction worth sitting with. Most people, when asked, will agree that everything changes. They'll nod at the idea that nothing is permanent, seasons, relationships, circumstances. They accept this in the abstract without difficulty. It feels obvious, even wise, and then life asks them to apply it to themselves, to their identity, to the version of who they are that they've been carrying for years. And suddenly the agreement vanishes, because accepting impermanence in the abstract costs nothing. Accepting it in the personal costs everything. That gap between the philosophy we claim and the one we actually live is exactly where Marcus Aurelius spent most of his life working. The Stoics were not the first philosophers to observe that everything changes. What distinguished the Stoic treatment of impermanence was not the observation itself, but the precision with which they located the source of human suffering in relation to it. Not in change, which they regarded as simply the nature of things, but in the human habit of treating change as an aberration, of organizing life around the assumption of permanence, and then experiencing each inevitable transition as a violation of something that was supposed to hold. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme more than almost any other in the Meditations, not because he found it easy, but precisely because he didn't. In Book 4, paragraph 3, he wrote that time is a river of vanishing moments, and that the person who grasps at any of them finds only the current continuing past their closed hand. In Book 9, paragraph 28, he observed that loss is simply change, and change is the one thing nature never stops. What made that choice possible for Marcus Aurelius was not emotional distance. He was not a cold man. The Meditations are saturated with genuine feeling, with grief and tenderness and the specific ache of a person who cares deeply about things he knows he cannot keep. What made it possible was philosophical honesty, the willingness to see what is actually the case, rather than what he wished were the case. Epictetus approached the same reality from the position of someone who had lost, involuntarily and completely, almost every external thing a person can lose, and had discovered in that loss something the Stoic tradition regards as the only genuinely durable possession, the capacity to choose one's orientation toward what cannot be changed. In the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, he identified the fundamental division of all things into those within our power and those outside it, and located identity, in its fixed and defended form, firmly in the second category. Seneca completed the triad with characteristic directness. In Letter 77, he wrote that the person who clings to any form of life past the moment of its genuine usefulness is not preserving something valuable. They are refusing something necessary. Impermanence in the Stoic framework is not the enemy of a good life, it is its condition. The person who understands this, not as a philosophical position adopted at a comfortable distance but as a lived reality, does not experience change as loss inflicted from outside. They experience it as the ongoing movement of a life being genuinely lived, the identity you're still protecting. It rarely announces itself. The former self you're still carrying doesn't present as an obvious attachment. It doesn't feel like clinging, doesn't register as fear, doesn't produce the kind of clear emotional signal that would make it easy to identify and address. It presents instead as the ordinary texture of who you are, as your values, your preferences, your characteristic ways of responding to situations, which is precisely why it's so difficult to see. Because some of those things are genuinely still yours, still accurate, still alive, still expressions of who you actually are rather than artifacts of who you used to be. And some of them are not. And the task of distinguishing between the two is among the most delicate and most important forms of self-examination a person can undertake. Here is what the protected former self typically looks like in practice. It looks like the professional identity that survived the career it belonged to. The person who was for a decade defined by a particular role, a particular level of expertise, a particular place in a particular hierarchy, and who continues to organize their sense of worth around those coordinates long after the role itself has ended or transformed. It looks like the relational identity that outlived the relationship, the person who was inside a long partnership, the responsible one or the creative one, and who finds, years after the partnership ended, that they are still performing those functions in contexts that neither require nor reward them. It looks like the story of struggle that became a core identity. The person who built genuine strength through a period of real difficulty and who has held on to the identity of someone in difficulty long after the difficulty itself has passed, because releasing it would mean releasing the meaning that was constructed around surviving it. It looks like the image of potential, the talented young person who was told early and often that they were going to do something remarkable, and who is still, decades later, living in relation to that projected future rather than the actual present. William James observed that the most important thing about a person is not what they think in the abstract, but the assumptions they make without noticing, the ones so deeply embedded in their self-concept that they function as the unexamined ground of all experience rather than as beliefs that could, in principle, be questioned. The former identity operates precisely at this level. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 10, paragraph 8, that a person should ask themselves, at regular intervals, what element of their present life belongs to the present, and what belongs only to habit, to history, to the inertia of a former arrangement that was never formally dissolved. That question, asked honestly, produces a specific kind of discomfort, because the answer for most people is that more belongs to history than they realized. The inventory is uncomfortable, but it is the only way to know with any precision what you are actually holding, and what, with sufficient honesty and courage, you might finally be ready to put down. What loyalty to the past actually costs. The costs of holding on to a former identity are rarely dramatic. They don't arrive as crises. They arrive as a persistent, barely perceptible narrowing of possibility, of presence, of the range of life that feels available and real. You know this feeling, not as pain exactly, but as a kind of chronic flatness. The sense that you're present in your life but not quite inside it. That something is slightly off, slightly behind, slightly less than what it could be, and you can't point to what it is. The first cost is opportunity. Specifically, the opportunities that cannot be seen from inside a former identity. Every self-concept functions as a lens. It brings certain things into focus and pushes others to the periphery. The identity of the person who is still, in their own self-understanding, the one who struggles, cannot clearly perceive the options available to someone who has moved through the struggle. The former identity doesn't just describe a position, it defines a horizon, and the life lived within it is bounded by that horizon regardless of what lies beyond. The second cost is relational, and it is in many ways the most immediately felt. Relationships organize themselves around the identities the people inside them are presenting. When one person continues to present a former self, continues to occupy the role of the one who needs rescuing, or the one who holds everything together, or the one who can always be counted on to minimize themselves, the relationship stabilizes around that presentation. The genuine self that exists beneath it has no room to enter, and the loneliness of being surrounded by people who know you well and somehow still miss you entirely is one of the most specific and most isolating experiences available. Seneca wrote in Letter 1 that the person who belongs to everyone belongs to no one, and that the life distributed in all directions, always reorganizing itself around others' expectations, eventually loses the center around which a genuine self might have formed. The third cost is the most fundamental, the cost of presence. The person living inside a former identity is never fully in the moment they are actually inhabiting. They are perpetually slightly elsewhere, in the chapter that ended in the version of life they are still performing. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Book 2, paragraph 14, that the person who does not direct their attention to what they are actually doing loses something that cannot be recovered. Not time in the abstract, but the specific, irreplaceable texture of the moment being lived. The former identity doesn't just cost future possibility, it costs the present. That negotiation, maintained long enough, becomes the life itself, and the life itself becomes the cost. The Stoic practice of letting go. The Stoic tradition is sometimes misread as a philosophy of detachment, a prescription for emotional distance from the things and people of life, offered as an antidote to the suffering that comes from caring too much. That reading misses what the Stoics were actually doing. They were not advising people to care less. They were advising people to care more precisely, to distinguish with real rigor and real honesty between what they were holding because it still belonged to them and what they were holding because releasing it felt too much like loss. The Stoic practice of letting go is not a technique. It is not a sequence of steps, a meditation practice, or a cognitive reframe applied to something painful. It is a discipline of perception, specifically the discipline of seeing what is actually the case about what you are carrying, rather than what you would prefer to be the case. And that discipline begins not with action, but with an honest inventory of where precisely the grip is. Marcus Aurelius described this practice in the Meditations with characteristic directness. In Book 4, Chapter 3, he wrote that a person should regularly examine the content of their own mind, not to judge it, but to see it clearly. What assumptions am I making about who I am that I have never questioned? What roles am I maintaining because they are genuinely still mine? And which am I maintaining because the alternative is a disorienting emptiness? Epictetus added a crucial distinction in the Enchiridion, Chapter 11, between using things as they were meant to be used and clinging to them as though their presence were required for your continuity as a person. The former is engagement with life. The latter is the specific form of suffering produced when identity becomes entangled with what is, by nature, temporary. He did not say that the things of life, roles, relationships, accomplishments, chapters, are worthless. He said that their value is in what they offer while they are present, not in what they cost to maintain after their moment has passed. Seneca was the most practical of the three on this point. In Letter 77, he described what he called the work of completion, the deliberate act of naming what has genuinely ended, honoring its meaning, and then releasing it with the full dignity that only an honest farewell can give. Not denial, not suppression, not the kind of forced positivity that refuses to acknowledge what is being lost. A real goodbye, said aloud in the interior, to the version of the self that was real and mattered, and whose time without drama and without apology has come to an end. That practice, honest inventory, clear-eyed acknowledgement, deliberate release, is not a single moment. It is ongoing. Because the identity does not release all at once. It loosens incrementally, through repeated acts of choosing the present over the past, the actual self over the protected one, what is over what was. How transition actually works. The image most people carry of identity transition is a clean one. You decide, you change, you become. A moment of clarity, a commitment, a new chapter beginning where the old one ended. That image is not just inaccurate, it is actively misleading, because it locates the difficulty in the decision and implies that if the decision is made clearly enough, the transition will follow cleanly. And so when the transition doesn't follow cleanly, when the decision has been made and remade, and the old pattern reasserts itself anyway, the person concludes that they have failed at something they should have been able to manage. They haven't failed. They have arrived at the actual territory of change which looks nothing like the map. Erik Erikson's work on identity development described what he called the transitional space, the period between identities when the old structure has genuinely loosened, but the new one has not yet formed. He gave this period a name, moratorium. Not paralysis, not failure, but a necessary interval of disorganization that is the actual mechanism through which genuine development proceeds. What that period feels like from the inside is disorienting in a specific way. The former self no longer fits. Its reflexes feel slightly off. Its habitual responses no longer quite match the life being lived. Its internal narrative no longer fully convinces. But the new self has not yet arrived. There is no coherent replacement story, no settled sense of who this is now, no reliable identity to orient from. The person is between, not the old, not yet the new. And that in-between space is characterized by a specific kind of anxiety that has no obvious object. Nothing is wrong in any identifiable way. Everything simply feels unsettled. This is the most important phase of the entire process, and it is the phase that most people, in their discomfort, try hardest to abbreviate. They reach for a new identity too quickly, grabbing the nearest available self-concept and inhabiting it before the transitional space has done its work. or they retreat back into the former identity, deciding that the discomfort of the in-between is a signal that the change was wrong, rather than a signal that it is real. Both moves are understandable. Neither produces the genuine forward movement they are intended to create. Marcus Aurelius described the discipline required in this space in the Meditations, Book 5, paragraph 8, where he wrote that the person who can endure the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, who does not force resolution before resolution is available, is practicing the highest form of the Stoic virtue of equanimity. Not indifference to the discomfort, full awareness of it, combined with the refusal to be driven by it into premature closure. The transitional space has a job to do. It is the interval in which the old self is being genuinely released, not just intellectually acknowledged, but actually loosened at the level of felt experience from the organizing role it has occupied. That loosening takes the time it takes, and the person who can remain present in it, neither forcing the process forward nor retreating from it, is not lost. They are, in the most precise sense available, in the middle of becoming, how to finally let go. What follows is not a technique. It is not a sequence of steps to be completed in order and checked off a list. It is a description of a practice, which means something that is engaged with repeatedly, imperfectly, and with the understanding that the engagement itself, rather than any specific outcome it produces, is the point. The first move is acknowledgement, genuine, specific, unhedged acknowledgement of what the former self actually was, not a summary, not a euphemism. The version of yourself you have been carrying was real. It was built through real experience, real effort, real relationship. It had genuine value, not in the past tense sense of something that was valuable once and isn't anymore, but in the sense that it was an authentic expression of who you were at a particular point in the movement of your life. That deserves to be said internally and explicitly before anything else. The second move is differentiation, the careful, honest work of distinguishing between what in your current self is a living expression of who you actually are and what is a maintained performance of who you used to be. This distinction is rarely clean, but there is a felt difference between responding from a place that is genuinely alive in you and responding from a place that is familiar, but no longer quite true. That felt difference is the signal. It is subtle, but it is available to anyone willing to look for it without immediate judgment of what they find. The third move is the most demanding: permission. Explicitly giving yourself permission to be different from who you were, not better, not improved, not a corrected version of the former self. Different. The person on the other side of a genuine identity transition is not the former self upgraded. They are a distinct configuration of the same continuing person, shaped by everything that came before, but no longer organized around it. Giving that person permission to exist, to take up space, to respond from their actual current reality, rather than the maintained narrative of a prior one, is the interior act that makes the external shift possible. Seneca wrote in Letter 34 that the person who becomes genuinely different does not abandon what they were. They carry it as history rather than as identity. The experiences are still there. The formative relationships are still there. The suffering that built something real is still there. But they are held as the material from which the present self was made, not as the definition of what the present self continues to be. That is the distinction between being shaped by the past and being held by it. Epictetus put the simplest version in the Enchiridion, chapter 17. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. Applied to identity, seek not that who you are should remain as it was, but allow who you are to be as it actually is. And the specific kind of stagnation that comes from holding on will begin on its own to dissolve. Not all at once, not without resistance, but genuinely, and in a direction that was always available, the moment you were willing to stop looking backward long enough to see it. Who you are when you stop holding on. There is a version of you that has been waiting, not in some imagined future, not in a better set of circumstances, not on the other side of a plan that hasn't quite come together. It has been waiting in the present, specifically in the space that becomes available when the former self is finally honestly set down. That space is not empty in the way that loss is empty. It is empty in the way that a room is empty after furniture that no longer fits has been removed. Functional, available, full of light that was always there but had nowhere to fall. What moves into that space is not a new identity imported from outside, not a reinvented self built to specification. It is simply the self that was always underneath the accumulation, the one that existed before the roles hardened into requirements, before the stories became fixed, before the maintenance of continuity became more automatic than the authentic response to what was actually happening. Marcus Aurelius described this quality, this return to an underlying simplicity, in the Meditations, Book 10, paragraph 8, where he wrote that the most powerful thing a person can do is reduce themselves to the essentials, to what they actually think, actually value, actually are, beneath the layering of social performance and accumulated self-concept. He was not prescribing poverty or isolation. He was describing the felt experience of a self that has stopped performing itself and started being itself. That experience is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is, in his word, free. What becomes possible in that freedom is not primarily the achievement of goals or the arrival at new heights of performance or success. What becomes possible is presence. Genuine, unmanaged, fully inhabited presence in the actual life being lived. The one in front of you, with its real textures and its real people and its real moments. Epictetus observed in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 1, that the person who has resolved the internal conflict between what they actually are and what they are performing themselves to be experiences a specific form of peace, not the peace of having solved all problems or eliminated all difficulty, but the peace of no longer fighting themselves. That internal fight is the real source of the exhaustion most people attribute to external circumstance. The circumstances change and the exhaustion remains, because the fight was never with the circumstances. It was always with the distance between the presented self and the actual one. Seneca ended letter 1 with the instruction that has outlasted everything else in that letter. Reclaim yourself, not a new self, not a better self. The self that was yours before it became organized around maintenance, before it became the performance of continuity, rather than the actual living of a life. That self has not gone anywhere. It has been there patiently underneath all of it, waiting not for circumstances to improve, not for the right moment to arrive, but for the one thing only you can give it, permission to be present, without apology, in the life that is actually yours. You are not stuck. You have never been stuck. You have been holding on, carefully, loyally, for reasons that were real, to a version of yourself that was built for a chapter that has ended. And the moment you open that hand, what you will find is not loss. It is everything that holding on was costing you, finally returned. The full weight of your actual life, available at last exactly as it is.